Sarah Chun limped across the dusty training ground, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right. The other recruits watched from the sidelines, some snickering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. How had someone like her even made it through the selection process for the elite Special Operations Training Program? "Look at her go," whispered Marcus, a tall blonde recruit from Texas. "She can barely walk straight. And they expect her to keep up with us?" Sarah had heard it all before. The whispers, the doubt, the barely concealed mockery. Born with a congenital hip dysplasia that left her with a permanent limp, she had faced skepticism her entire life. Doctors had told her parents she would never be athletic. Teachers had steered her away from physical activities. Even her own family had gently suggested she pursue more suitable careers. But Sarah had other plans. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, Sarah had discovered martial arts at the age of 8. Her mother had enrolled her in a local karate class, hoping it might help with her confidence and coordination. The sensei, an elderly Japanese man named Takashi Yamamoto, had taken one look at Sarah's determined eyes and agreed to train her, despite her physical limitation. "The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire," Sensei Yamamoto had told her during those early days. "Your challenge will become your greatest strength." Years of training had taught Sarah to compensate for her limp in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She learned to use her center of gravity differently, to move with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given her condition. Her punches carried devastating power because she had learned to channel all her body's energy through precise movements. Her kicks, though limited in height, struck with surgical precision. By the time she graduated high school, Sarah had earned black belts in 3 different martial arts disciplines. She had also excelled academically, graduating valedictorian with a full scholarship to study international relations at Georgetown University. But her heart was set on something else entirely: serving her country in the military's most elite units. The path had not been easy. Military recruiters had initially rejected her application outright. It took months of appeals, medical evaluations, and demonstrations of her capabilities before she was even allowed to attempt the basic training program. She had to prove, again and again, that her limp did not make her a liability. Basic training had been brutal, but Sarah had persevered. While other recruits complained about the physical demands, she pushed herself harder than anyone else. She was always the first to volunteer for the most challenging exercises, the first to help struggling teammates, and the last to give up on any task. Her drill sergeant, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Rodriguez, had been skeptical at first. "Chun, you sure you're in the right place?" he had asked during her first week. "This isn't a charity program." But as weeks passed, Rodriguez began to notice something extraordinary about the young woman with the limp. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and somehow always found a way to complete every challenge. More importantly, she had a natural talent for strategy and leadership that set her apart from her peers. "That girl's got something special," Rodriguez confided to his fellow instructors. "I've trained thousands of soldiers, and I've rarely seen someone with her combination of determination and tactical intelligence." Sarah's reputation began to spread throughout the base. Stories circulated about the recruit who could take down opponents twice her size, who could navigate obstacle courses that left others exhausted, who could solve complex tactical problems faster than seasoned officers. The initial mockery gradually transformed into grudging respect. After completing basic training with honors, Sarah was accepted into the Special Operations Training Program, one of only 12 candidates selected from over 300 applicants. The program was designed to identify and train the military's future elite operatives, individuals capable of operating independently in the most dangerous and complex situations imaginable. The other 11 candidates were impressive in their own right. There was Jake Morrison, a former college football star with muscles that seemed carved from granite. Maria Santos, a marathon runner who could outpace almost anyone over long distances. David Kim, a computer genius with degrees from MIT. Each brought unique skills and physical attributes that made them obvious choices for elite training. And then there was Sarah, the girl with the limp who somehow kept pace with them all. The first few weeks of the program focused on advanced physical conditioning and combat training. Sarah struggled more than the others with some exercises, particularly those requiring explosive speed or long-distance running. But she excelled in areas that surprised her instructors: close-quarters combat, tactical planning, and psychological resilience. During hand-to-hand combat sessions, Sarah consistently outperformed her peers. Her unconventional movement patterns, developed to compensate for her limp, made her unpredictable and difficult to counter. She moved like water, flowing around attacks, and striking from unexpected angles. "How does she do that?" wondered Captain Phillips, one of the program instructors, as he watched Sarah effortlessly defeat Jake Morrison in a sparring match. Morrison outweighed her by 60 pounds and had trained in boxing since childhood, yet Sarah had taken him down in under 30 seconds. The answer lay in Sarah's unique approach to combat. While others relied on brute strength or speed, she had learned to read her opponents, to anticipate their movements, and to use their own momentum against them. Her years of adapting to physical limitations had taught her to think creatively, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. As the weeks progressed, the training became increasingly complex. The candidates were introduced to advanced weapons systems, surveillance techniques, and psychological warfare methods. They learned to operate in hostile environments, to gather intelligence, and to work as part of small teams in high-stress situations. Sarah excelled in the intellectual and strategic components of the training. Her academic background and natural analytical skills made her a standout in areas like threat assessment, cultural intelligence, and mission planning. She could speak 4 languages fluently and had an uncanny ability to understand and predict human behavior. But it was during a particular training exercise that Sarah truly began to stand out from her peers. The exercise was designed to test the candidate's ability to infiltrate a secured facility and extract valuable intelligence without being detected. Most of the other candidates attempted to use stealth and technology to avoid the guards and security systems. Sarah took a different approach. Instead of trying to sneak past the security, she walked right up to the front entrance, limping slightly and carrying a clipboard. She had studied the facility's personnel files and learned that they employed several individuals with disabilities. By posing as a new employee reporting for her first day of work, she was able to gain access to restricted areas without raising suspicion. "Brilliant," murmured Colonel Harrison, the program director, as he watched Sarah's approach on the surveillance monitors. "She's using her perceived weakness as an asset." The guards see the limp and immediately categorize her as harmless, non-threatening. They're not even really looking at her. Within 40 minutes, Sarah had obtained the target intelligence and exited the facility without triggering a single alarm. The other candidates had taken hours to complete the same task, and several had been captured by the guards. Word of Sarah's performance began to reach higher levels of the military hierarchy. General Patricia Walsh, one of the few female generals in the Special Operations Command, took a particular interest in the young woman's progress. "I want to meet this Chun recruit," General Walsh told Colonel Harrison during a routine briefing. "Her scores are exceptional, but what really interests me is her approach to problem solving. She thinks outside the box in ways that could be invaluable in real-world operations." The meeting was arranged for the following week. Sarah reported to General Walsh's office, nervous but determined to make a good impression. The general was a legendary figure in military circles, known for her strategic brilliance and uncompromising standards. "At ease, Chun," General Walsh said as Sarah entered the office. "I've been following your progress with great interest. Tell me, what drives you to pursue this path despite the obvious challenges?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but when the moment came, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than reciting a rehearsed response. "Ma'am, I've spent my entire life being told what I can't do because of my limp. People see my limitation before they see my capabilities. But I've learned that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths if we're willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough to transform them." General Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah's face. "And how has your limitation become a strength?" "It's taught me to never take anything for granted, ma'am. While others rely on their natural advantages, I've had to develop skills and strategies that they never needed to learn. I've had to become more observant, more analytical, more creative in my approach to every challenge. And, perhaps most importantly, It's taught me that appearance can be deceiving. People consistently underestimate me, which gives me a significant tactical advantage. The general nodded slowly. Interesting perspective. I understand you've been having some issues with your fellow candidates. Some of them question whether you belong in this program. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Yes, ma'am. Some of them do. How do you handle that? I let my performance speak for itself, ma'am. I can't control what others think or say about me, but I can control how I respond to their doubts. I use their skepticism as motivation to work harder and perform better. General Walsh smiled for the first time during the conversation. Good answer. I have one more question for you, Chen. If you successfully complete this program, you'll likely face situations where your life and the lives of others depend entirely on your ability to perform under extreme pressure. Are you confident that your physical limitation won't compromise your effectiveness in such situations? Sarah met the general's gaze without hesitation. Ma'am, I'm not just confident that my limitation won't compromise my effectiveness. I'm confident that it will enhance it. I've spent years learning to overcome challenges that would stop others in their tracks. When the situation becomes impossible, when conventional approaches fail, that's when I'm most in my element. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, during which General Walsh asked detailed questions about Sarah's training, her tactical thinking, and her long-term career goals. By the end of the conversation, the general was thoroughly impressed. Colonel Harrison, she said later that day, I want Chen fast-tracked for advanced tactical training. She has the potential to become one of our most valuable operatives. As Sarah's reputation continued to grow, so did the resentment among some of her fellow candidates. They couldn't understand how someone with her obvious physical limitation continued to outperform them in so many areas. The mockery became more subtle but more persistent. During meals in the mess hall, conversations would quiet when Sarah approached. During group exercises, some candidates would exchange knowing looks when Sarah was assigned to their team. The message was clear. They saw her as a burden, someone who had been given special treatment because of political correctness rather than merit. Sarah was aware of the dynamics, but chose to focus on her training rather than the social politics. She knew that ultimately, her performance would determine her future, not the opinions of her peers. One evening, as she sat alone reviewing tactical manuals in the base library, Jake Morrison approached her table. Morrison was widely regarded as the strongest and most physically capable candidate in the program, and he had been particularly vocal about his doubts regarding Sarah's inclusion. Can we talk? He asked, pulling out a chair without waiting for her response. Sarah looked up from her manual. What's on your mind, Morrison? Look, I'm going to be straight with you, he said, leaning forward. A lot of us are wondering why you're here. This program is supposed to be for the best of the best, people who can handle any physical challenge thrown at them. And, no offense, but you're clearly not capable of meeting those standards. Sarah closed her manual and gave Morrison her full attention. What standards am I not meeting? Come on, Chun. You know what I'm talking about. The obstacle courses, the endurance runs, the physical fitness requirements. You're always struggling to keep up. Am I? Sarah asked calmly. Have I failed to complete any required exercise? Have I fallen below any minimum standard? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Well, no, but have I performed poorly in any tactical evaluation? Have I failed to contribute effectively to any team exercise? No, but that's not the point. Then, what is the point, Morrison? Sarah interrupted. Because from where I sit, it seems like you're upset that someone who doesn't look like your idea of an elite soldier is outperforming you in many areas. Morrison's face reddened. That's not what this is about, isn't it? Sarah stood up, gathering her materials. Let me tell you something, Morrison. While you've been worrying about how I look and whether I belong here, I've been focused on becoming the best operative I can be. My limp isn't going anywhere, but neither am I. So you can either accept that and focus on your own performance, or you can keep wasting energy on something you can't control. She walked away, leaving Morrison sitting alone at the table. The confrontation marked a turning point in the group dynamics. Word of the exchange spread quickly among the candidates, and Sarah noticed a subtle shift in how some of them interacted with her. A few began to show grudging respect for her directness and confidence. Others doubled down on their skepticism. But Sarah's focus remained unchanged. She continued to push herself harder than anyone else, continued to excel in areas that played to her strengths, and continued to find ways to overcome her limitations. She was building something more than just physical and tactical skills. She was building an unshakable confidence in her own abilities. As the first phase of training neared its end, the candidates were informed that they would face a series of final evaluations that would determine who would advance to the next level of the program. Only 8 of the 12 would be selected to continue. The announcement created a new level of tension and competition among the group. Everyone knew that their future careers depended on their performance in the upcoming tests. For Sarah, it represented the ultimate validation of her decision to pursue this path despite all the obstacles and skepticism she had faced. She spent the final weeks before the evaluations intensifying her training regimen. While others focused on their weak areas, Sarah worked to make her strengths even stronger. She practiced combat scenarios until her movements became instinctive. She studied tactical manuals until she could recite complex strategies from memory. She pushed her physical conditioning to levels that seemed impossible given her starting point. The night before the evaluations began, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. From the 8-year-old girl who had been told she would never be athletic, to the high school valedictorian who had shocked everyone by choosing military service, to the recruit who had faced constant skepticism and mockery. Tomorrow would determine whether all the sacrifice, all the hard work, all the determination had been worth it. Tomorrow would show whether the girl with the limp could truly compete with the best of the best. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled. She was ready. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at 0400 hours, jolting all 12 candidates from their sleep. Sarah had been awake for the past hour, her mind racing through potential scenarios they might face during the final evaluations. Today would determine who among them had what it took to advance to the elite tier of military operations. "Move, move, move," shouted Sergeant Rodriguez as the candidates scrambled from their bunks. "Full gear, combat ready, in the courtyard in 10 minutes. Anyone who's late can pack their bags and go home." Sarah had learned to prepare for quick mobilizations during her months of training. While others fumbled with their equipment in the darkness, she moved with practiced efficiency. Her gear was always organized exactly the same way, allowing her to dress and equip herself rapidly, even in complete darkness. It was another adaptation she had developed to compensate for the extra time her limp sometimes required for movement. Within 8 minutes, all 12 candidates stood at attention in the courtyard, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Colonel Harrison emerged from the administrative building, flanked by several senior officers Sarah didn't recognize. Their presence indicated that today's evaluations would be closely observed by decision-makers from the highest levels of command. "Today begins your final evaluation period," Colonel Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Over the next 72 hours, you will face challenges designed to test every skill you've developed during this program. Intelligence gathering, physical conditioning, tactical planning, psychological resilience, and, most importantly, your ability to perform under extreme pressure when lives are on the line." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. 8 of you will advance to Phase 2 of the program. 4 of you will be reassigned to conventional military units. The difference between success and failure may come down to split-second decisions and your ability to adapt when everything goes wrong. One of the unfamiliar officers stepped forward. Sarah recognized the insignia of a Navy SEAL commander, though she didn't know his name. "Your first challenge begins now," the commander said. "You have 30 minutes to reach the coordinates that will be transmitted to your GPS units. You will travel as individuals, not as a team. The first 8 to arrive will receive an advantage in subsequent challenges. The last 4 to arrive will face an immediate elimination challenge." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. A pure speed and endurance test was exactly the kind of challenge that played to her weaknesses. The coordinates appeared on her GPS unit, a location approximately 8 miles away through rough terrain that included dense forest, steep hills, and at least one river crossing. "Your time starts now," the commander said. The candidates scattered in different directions, each choosing their own route to the destination. Sarah quickly studied her GPS and the topographical data, looking for the path that would best suit her capabilities. While the others headed directly toward the coordinates, choosing routes that prioritized straight-line distance, Sarah identified a longer but less physically demanding path that followed established trails and avoided the steepest climbs. Jake Morrison and two other physically imposing candidates immediately took the lead, their powerful strides carrying them rapidly across the uneven ground. Sarah watched them disappear into the forest, then set off on her chosen route at a steady, sustainable pace. The first mile was deceptively easy, following a well-maintained trail through relatively flat terrain. Sarah used this section to warm up her muscles and establish a rhythm that she could maintain over the long distance. Her years of training had taught her the importance of pacing, especially when dealing with her physical limitations. As the trail began to climb into the hills, Sarah found herself alone. The other candidates had either pulled far ahead or were following different routes entirely. The solitude was welcome. It allowed her to focus completely on her movement and navigation without the distraction of trying to keep pace with others. The steep sections proved challenging, as expected. Sarah's limp made uphill climbing more difficult, forcing her to take shorter steps and rest more frequently than the other candidates likely needed. But she had prepared for this, incorporating hill training into her conditioning regimen for months. She knew her limits and how to push them without breaking. 2 hours into the challenge, Sarah reached the river crossing. The water was deeper and faster moving than she had anticipated, clearly swollen by recent rains. She could see evidence that at least 2 other candidates had already crossed at this point, broken branches and muddy footprints on the far bank. Rather than attempting to ford the river at the obvious crossing point, Sarah moved downstream for several hundred yards until she found a location where fallen trees created a natural bridge. The crossing was more precarious than wading through the water, but it allowed her to keep her equipment dry and avoid the energy-sapping effects of wet clothing. On the far side of the river, the terrain became even more challenging. The GPS indicated that the destination was still 4 miles away, mostly through dense forest with no established trails. Sarah had to rely entirely on her navigation skills and compass reading to maintain the correct heading. It was here that her unconventional approach began to pay dividends. While the stronger, faster candidates had likely powered through the early sections and were now dealing with fatigue, Sarah's steady, measured pace had conserved her energy for the most difficult portions of the route. She was tired but not exhausted, focused, and alert rather than simply grinding forward on willpower alone. The forest was eerily quiet except for the sound of her own breathing and footsteps. Occasionally, she would hear crashes and voices in the distance, indicating the positions of other candidates, but she had no way of knowing whether she was ahead of or behind the main group. With 2 miles remaining, Sarah encountered her most significant obstacle, a steep ravine that had not shown clearly on the topographical map. She could hear voices from the bottom of the ravine, suggesting that other candidates were attempting to climb down one side and up the other. From her position on the rim, Sarah could see that this approach would require significant technical climbing skills and would be extremely time-consuming. Instead, she followed the rim of the ravine for nearly a mile until she found a location where erosion had created a gentler slope that could be navigated without ropes or advanced climbing techniques. The detour added distance, but saved time and energy compared to the technical descent and ascent that the others were attempting. As she emerged from the forest and approached the final coordinates, Sarah could see the destination, a small clearing with a checkpoint manned by 2 instructors. To her surprise, only 3 other candidates had arrived before her. Jake Morrison was there, as expected, along with Maria Santos and David Kim. The other 8 candidates were still somewhere on the course. "Chun, you're number 4, announced Sergeant Rodriguez as she approached the checkpoint. Outstanding navigation and route selection. Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. Not only had she avoided being in the bottom 4, but she had actually outperformed 8 of her supposedly more physically capable peers through superior planning and execution. Over the next hour, the remaining candidates trickled in. Some arrived exhausted and dehydrated, having pushed too hard in the early sections. Others were soaked and mud-covered from difficult river crossings. 2 candidates required medical attention for injuries sustained during their attempts to navigate the ravine. The last candidate to arrive was Thomas Walsh, a former college track star who had been expected to excel in any endurance-based challenge. He stumbled into the clearing nearly 3 hours after Sarah, clearly disoriented and showing signs of severe dehydration. That completes the navigation challenge. Colonel Harrison announced once all candidates had been accounted for. The first 8 to arrive have earned priority selection for tomorrow's team challenges. Morrison, Santos, Kim, Chun, Patterson, Bradley, Williams, and Foster will serve as team leaders. Sarah was stunned to hear her name called as one of the team leaders. Not only had she avoided elimination, but she had earned a position of authority for the next phase of evaluation. The shocked expressions on some of the other candidates' faces made it clear that they were equally surprised. Team leaders will now select their teams, the colonel continued. You'll choose from the 4 remaining candidates, Lopez, Miller, Thompson, and Walsh. Each team will consist of 3 members total. The leader plus 2 selected team members. The selection process was tense. Each team leader was called in order of their arrival at the checkpoint. Morrison chose Lopez, a former Marine with excellent combat skills. Santos selected Miller, who had a background in communications and technology. Kim chose Thompson, recognizing his expertise in languages and cultural intelligence. When Sarah's turn came, the 2 remaining candidates were Patterson and Walsh. Patterson was physically strong and had performed well in most training exercises, but Sarah had observed that he tended to take risks unnecessarily and sometimes ignored input from others. Walsh was still recovering from his navigation failure, but had consistently demonstrated good judgment and teamwork skills throughout the program. I select Walsh, Sarah announced. Several of the observers raised eyebrows at her choice. Walsh was clearly the weaker performer of the 2 remaining candidates, still showing effects from his poor navigation performance. But Sarah had made her decision based on compatibility and trust rather than raw capability. Interesting choice, Chun, Colonel Harrison commented. Care to explain your reasoning? Walsh has shown good tactical judgment and works well with others, Sarah replied. For the challenges we're likely to face, I believe team cohesion and mutual support will be more important than individual physical performance. The colonel nodded approvingly. We'll see if your assessment proves correct. The teams were given the remainder of the day to rest, plan, and prepare for the next phase of evaluation. Sarah spent time getting to know Walsh better and discussing their combined strengths and weaknesses. Despite his poor performance in the navigation challenge, Walsh had valuable skills in psychological assessment and interrogation techniques that could prove useful in unknown scenarios. That evening, the team leaders were briefed on the next day's challenge, a complex hostage rescue simulation that would test their ability to gather intelligence, plan tactical operations, and execute under pressure. Each team would face the same scenario, but would be evaluated independently. Success would be measured not just on mission completion, but on the tactical soundness of their planning, their adaptation to unexpected complications, and their ability to minimize casualties. Sarah spent hours that night studying the briefing materials and developing multiple contingency plans. The scenario involved a terrorist group holding civilians in an abandoned factory complex. The teams would have access to limited intelligence about the facility layout, the number and disposition of hostages, and the capabilities of the terrorist group. What made the challenge particularly complex was that each team would face slightly different variations of the scenario. Some would discover that their intelligence was partially incorrect. Others would encounter unexpected complications during execution. The evaluators wanted to see how the teams adapted when their carefully laid plans encountered the chaos of real-world operations. Sarah's team met before dawn to review their plans and prepare their equipment. Walsh had recovered significantly from his exhaustion of the previous day and was showing the tactical acuity that had earned him a place in the program originally. Their third team member was Bradley, a steady performer who brought strong technical skills and attention to detail. Our primary advantage is going to be adaptability, Sarah told her team. We're not the strongest or the fastest team, but we can outthink the opposition if we stay flexible and communicate effectively. The simulation began at 0600 hours. Sarah's team was transported to a staging area 1 mile from the target facility and given 2 hours to conduct reconnaissance, finalize their plans, and prepare for execution. They were equipped with standard military weapons, communications gear, and surveillance equipment. Sarah immediately sent Walsh to conduct visual reconnaissance of the facility while she and Bradley analyzed the intelligence reports and satellite imagery. The factory complex was larger and more complex than the briefing had indicated, with multiple buildings, numerous potential entry and exit points, and limited visibility into the interior spaces where hostages might be held. Walsh returned with concerning news. There were more guards visible than the intelligence reports had suggested, and their patrol patterns were more sophisticated than expected. The terrorist group appeared to be better trained and equipped than originally assessed. "We need to revise our approach," Sarah told her team. "The direct assault plan we discussed isn't going to work with this level of opposition. We need something more subtle." Bradley suggested a diversion approach, creating a disturbance at one end of the complex to draw guards away from the hostage location. Walsh proposed trying to infiltrate the facility covertly rather than fighting their way in. Both ideas had merit, but Sarah was developing a different concept. "What if we don't try to sneak in at all?" she said. "What if we walk right up to the front door?" Her teammates looked at her skeptically. "Explain," Walsh said. Sarah outlined her plan. Instead of approaching as soldiers, they would pose as journalists or humanitarian workers seeking to negotiate with the terrorists. Her limp would actually enhance this deception, making her appear less threatening and more credible as a non-combatant. Once inside the facility, they could gather detailed intelligence about hostage locations and guard dispositions, then execute a precisely targeted rescue operation. "That's extremely risky," Bradley pointed out. "If they discover our true identity before we're ready to act, we'll be captured or killed, and the hostages will likely be executed." "All our options are risky," Sarah replied. "But this approach gives us the best chance of gathering accurate, real-time intelligence while minimizing the risk of a prolonged firefight that could result in civilian casualties." After extensive discussion, the team agreed to attempt Sarah's plan. They changed into civilian clothing and prepared cover identities as freelance journalists investigating the political situation. Sarah would take the lead as the senior correspondent, with Walsh as her photographer and Bradley as their technical support. The approach to the facility was nerve-wracking. They walked openly along the access road, carrying cameras and notebooks instead of weapons, while armed guards watched from concealed positions. Sarah forced herself to maintain the natural, slightly unsteady gait that her limp produced, knowing that any sign of military bearing or tactical awareness could blow their cover. At the main entrance, they were stopped by two guards armed with automatic weapons. Sarah stepped forward, speaking in accented English and claiming to represent an international news organization interested in interviewing the group's leader about their political objectives. "We are not here as enemies," she said, allowing her voice to show nervousness that was only partially feigned. "We want to tell your story to the world, to help people understand your cause." The guards were suspicious but intrigued. After several tense minutes of questioning and radio communication with their superiors, Sarah's team was escorted into the main building under heavy guard. They had successfully penetrated the facility, but they were now completely dependent on their ability to maintain their cover while gathering the intelligence they needed. Inside the factory, Sarah observed everything while maintaining the appearance of a nervous journalist. She noted the locations of guards, the layout of the building, and, most importantly, the sounds and signs that indicated where the hostages were being held. Her years of training and observation and analysis served her well as she mentally cataloged every detail that might be useful for the rescue operation. The team was brought before the terrorist leader, a charismatic but clearly dangerous individual who was suspicious of their motives but tempted by the opportunity for international publicity. Sarah played her role perfectly, asking questions about the group's political objectives while subtly probing for information about the facility and their security measures. After 30 minutes of careful questioning, Sarah had learned everything she needed to know. The hostages were being held in the basement of the adjacent building, guarded by 4 men. The facility had a total of 12 terrorists, most of them positioned to defend against external assault. There were 2 possible escape routes from the basement, but both were heavily monitored. Now came the most dangerous part of the plan, transitioning from intelligence gathering to action. Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, a request that was granted after some discussion among the guards. She was escorted by a single guard to a restroom at the end of a hallway, out of sight of the main group. In the bathroom, Sarah made her move. When the guard turned his back momentarily, she struck with lightning speed, using techniques she had perfected during months of combat training. The guard was unconscious within seconds, taken down by a precise strike to a pressure point that rendered him helpless without causing permanent injury. Sarah quickly searched the guard's equipment, taking his radio, keys, and sidearm. She then used the radio to send a coded message to Walsh and Bradley, indicating that the action phase had begun. The message was disguised as a request for additional camera equipment, but her teammates recognized the signal and began their own preparations. Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah moved through the facility with the confidence of someone who belonged there, her limp actually helping to maintain her cover as a harmless civilian. She systematically neutralized 3 more guards using her specialized combat techniques, each time striking from unexpected angles and using her opponent's assumptions about her limitations against them. Meanwhile, Walsh and Bradley had managed to excuse themselves from the interview and were making their way toward the basement where the hostages were held. The plan was working perfectly until an unexpected complication arose. One of the guards Sarah had neutralized was discovered by a patrol, triggering an alarm that put the entire facility on high alert. Suddenly, the simulation became a race against time. The terrorists realized they had been infiltrated and began moving to execute the hostages. Sarah found herself cut off from her teammates, alone in a hostile facility with armed enemies closing in from all directions. But this was exactly the kind of situation where her unique combination of skills and experience gave her an advantage. While conventional soldiers might have tried to fight their way out through superior firepower, Sarah used her intelligence and unconventional movement patterns to evade capture while continuing to pursue the mission objectives. She moved through the facility like a ghost, using her knowledge of the building layout to avoid enemy patrols while working her way toward the basement. Her limp, which had been a source of mockery and doubt from her peers, now became a tactical asset. Guards who glimpsed her movement dismissed her as a fleeing civilian rather than recognizing her as a threat. In the basement, Walsh and Bradley had engaged the guards holding the hostages, but were pinned down by superior numbers. The simulated hostages were in immediate danger, and the 2-man team was running out of options. Sarah arrived at exactly the right moment, approaching from an unexpected direction through a maintenance access that she had identified during her reconnaissance. The guards holding Walsh and Bradley were focused entirely on the firefight to their front and had no idea that danger was approaching from behind. What happened next would become legendary in military training circles. Sarah emerged from the maintenance access and neutralized all 4 guards in less than 30 seconds, moving with a fluid, almost dance-like grace that seemed impossible for someone with her physical limitations. She struck with surgical precision, using each guard's position and momentum against them, turning their numerical advantage into a liability as they interfered with each other's ability to respond to her attack. The hostages were secured, the facility was neutralized, and the mission was complete. Sarah's team had achieved total success with 0 casualties and minimal use of force. More importantly, they had demonstrated exactly the kind of creative problem-solving and adaptability that the Special Operations Command was looking for in their elite operatives. As the simulation ended and the evaluators emerged to assess the results, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she had accomplished. She had not just proven that she belonged in the program. She had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of her supposedly superior peers. The girl with the limp had just shown that she might be the most dangerous person in the room. The debriefing room was unusually crowded that afternoon. In addition to Colonel Harrison and the regular training staff, Sarah counted at least 6 senior officers she had never seen before, including General Patricia Walsh and a man wearing the insignia of a Pentagon liaison. The presence of such high-ranking officials for a training exercise evaluation was unprecedented. Before we discuss individual performance, Colonel Harrison began, I want to address the overall results of this simulation. Of the 8 teams that participated, only 2 achieved complete mission success with 0 casualties. 3 teams completed the primary objective, but with significant simulated losses. Two teams failed to complete the mission within the time parameters. One team was completely eliminated during the operation. Sarah sat quietly beside Walsh and Bradley, trying to read the expressions of the senior officers. Their faces revealed nothing, maintaining the poker-faced neutrality that came with years of military leadership experience. Team Alpha, led by Morrison, demonstrated excellent tactical planning and superior firepower application, the colonel continued. They completed the mission but, with 3 simulated casualties among the hostages and 2 among their own team members. Their approach was conventional but effective. Morrison nodded grimly. His team had chosen the direct assault approach, overwhelming the facility with coordinated firepower and speed. It had worked, but at a cost that would have been unacceptable in a real-world operation. Team Delta, led by Santos, showed outstanding reconnaissance capabilities and achieved mission success with minimal casualties through patient observation and precise timing. Their approach exemplified the value of thorough preparation and disciplined execution. Sarah felt a twinge of concern. Santos had always been one of the strongest candidates, and her team's success meant that Sarah's own performance would be compared against an exceptionally high standard. And then, Colonel Harrison paused, consulting his notes. "We have Team Charlie, led by Chun." The room seemed to grow quieter, if that were possible. Sarah felt every eye in the room focusing on her, and she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression despite her racing heartbeat. Team Charlie's approach was unconventional, the colonel said, and Sarah detected what might have been the hint of a smile. Rather than relying on stealth or overwhelming force, they chose to infiltrate the facility through deception, gathering real-time intelligence while maintaining operational flexibility. General Walsh leaned forward slightly, her attention clearly focused on the discussion. The execution of this plan required not only tactical sophistication, but also exceptional individual combat skills when the situation deteriorated. Colonel Harrison continued. Team Charlie achieved complete mission success with 0 casualties, minimum use of force, and maximum preservation of intelligence assets. Their performance was remarkable. The Pentagon liaison spoke for the first time. "Colonel, I'd like to review the surveillance footage of Chin's individual combat sequence in the basement. I understand there were some unusual elements to her performance." Sarah's stomach tightened. The phrase, unusual elements, could be interpreted in many ways, and not all of them were positive. "Certainly, sir." Colonel Harrison activated the room's video display system. This footage shows the final phase of the hostage rescue operation. Chin had infiltrated the facility alone while her teammates engaged the guards holding the hostages. The video began playing, showing Sarah's approach through the maintenance access. Even watching it after the fact, Sarah was struck by how different her movement patterns were from conventional military training. Her limp was clearly visible, but so was something else, a flowing, adaptive quality that seemed almost liquid. On screen, Sarah emerged from the access point and immediately assessed the tactical situation. 4 armed guards were positioned around the basement room, with Walsh and Bradley pinned down behind concrete barriers. The hostages were clustered in the center of the room, effectively preventing any use of explosives or suppressing fire. What happened next unfolded in less than 30 seconds, but the slow-motion replay revealed the incredible sophistication of Sarah's tactics. She approached the first guard from his blind spot, moving with a rolling gait that masked her approach as the natural movement of someone with a physical disability. When she struck, it was with devastating precision, targeting pressure points that immediately incapacitated her opponent. The second guard turned at the sound of his colleague falling, but Sarah was already moving, flowing around his defensive position like water around a stone. Her limp caused her to bob and weave in patterns that conventional training couldn't predict, making her movements difficult to track and counter. She took him down with a combination of strikes that used his own momentum against him. Guards 3 and 4 realized something was wrong and began turning toward the threat, but Sarah was already among them. Her unconventional movement patterns meant that their training and muscle memory worked against them. They expected certain types of attacks from certain angles, but Sarah's approach was unlike anything they had practiced defending against. The final guard managed to get his weapon partially raised before Sarah reached him, but she flowed under his line of fire, her limp actually helping her maintain a lower profile than a conventional attacker would have achieved. Her final strike was a textbook example of using an opponent's strength against them, redirecting his momentum to send him crashing into the concrete wall. The room was silent as the video ended. Finally, the Pentagon liaison spoke. Chun, how would you describe your combat methodology? It's unlike anything in our standard training protocols. Sarah chose her words carefully. Sir, my physical limitations forced me to develop alternative approaches to combat situations. I can't rely on speed or brute strength, so I've focused on reading opponents, predicting their movements, and using their expectations against them. Most people see my limp and categorize me as non-threatening, which gives me a significant tactical advantage. General Walsh spoke up. You're essentially using your disability as a weapon? In a sense, yes, ma'am. People make assumptions about my capabilities based on my appearance. Those assumptions create blind spots that I can exploit tactically. The Pentagon liaison exchanged glances with General Walsh before continuing. We've never seen anything quite like your approach, Chun. The question is whether it can be taught to others or if it's specific to your particular situation. Colonel Harrison interjected. If I may, sir, I think that's exactly what makes Chun so valuable. Her approach to problem-solving is completely unique. She doesn't think like other operators because she can't rely on the same tools and methods. That forces her to be more creative, more adaptive. Interesting point, the general said. Chun, what's your assessment of your teammates' performance during this exercise? Sarah had been dreading this question. Military culture emphasized team success over individual accomplishment, and she was concerned about appearing to take too much credit for the mission's success. Ma'am, Walsh, and Bradley performed excellently throughout the operation. Walsh's reconnaissance and cultural assessment capabilities were essential for developing our infiltration plan. Bradley's technical skills allowed us to maintain communications and adapt our approach when complications arose. The mission succeeded because each team member contributed their unique strengths to overcome different challenges. She paused, then decided to add one more thought. I would also note that my approach only worked because of the foundation laid by the entire team. Individual tactics are meaningless without proper planning, intelligence, and support. General Walsh nodded approvingly. Good answer. Leadership is about maximizing team performance, not individual glory. The debriefing continued for another hour, with detailed analysis of every aspect of the simulation. Sarah's performance was dissected and discussed, but always in the context of overall tactical excellence rather than as a curiosity or exception to normal standards. When the session finally ended, Sarah was approached by Colonel Harrison. Chun, you've been selected to advance to Phase 2 of the program, he said quietly. But I want you to understand that your real challenges are just beginning. Phase 2 will expose you to the most sensitive and dangerous operations in our military arsenal. The physical demands will be extreme, and the psychological pressure will be unlike anything you've experienced. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. I'm ready. I believe you are, Harrison replied. But there's something else you need to know. Your performance has attracted attention from some very high places. There are people in Washington who think you represent the future of special operations. That attention could be a tremendous asset to your career, but it also means you'll be under constant scrutiny. Over the following weeks, Sarah was integrated into Phase 2 training alongside 7 other candidates who had advanced from various training programs. The group included some of the most promising operators from across all branches of the military, individuals who had already proven themselves in conventional special operations units. Sarah was the only candidate with a visible physical disability, and once again she found herself dealing with skepticism and doubt from new peers. But this time, the dynamic was different. Word of her performance in Phase 1 had preceded her, and even the skeptics acknowledged that she had earned her place through demonstrated competence. The training itself was unlike anything she had experienced before. Where Phase 1 had focused on basic special operations skills, Phase 2 introduced elements that bordered on science fiction. Advanced surveillance technologies, experimental weapons systems, psychological warfare techniques that seemed pulled from spy novels. Sarah excelled in the intellectual and strategic components of the training. Her ability to think unconventionally, which had been developed through years of adapting to her physical limitations, made her particularly effective at analyzing complex scenarios and developing creative solutions. One particular exercise stood out, a counterintelligence simulation where the candidates were required to identify and neutralize a network of enemy agents operating within a simulated American city. The scenario was designed to test their ability to blend into civilian environments, gather human intelligence, and conduct operations without triggering enemy suspicions. Most of the candidates approached the exercise as a detective story, using surveillance and analysis to track down the enemy agents. Sarah took a different approach. Instead of hunting the agents, she positioned herself to be recruited by them. Using her cover identity as a disabled veteran seeking government employment, Sarah made herself an attractive target for enemy recruitment. Her apparent vulnerability and potential access to sensitive information made her exactly the kind of asset that foreign intelligence services sought to cultivate. The enemy agents, played by experienced instructors, approached her within 48 hours of the exercise beginning. They saw exactly what Sarah wanted them to see: a bitter, disabled veteran who felt abandoned by her government and might be willing to provide information in exchange for financial support. Over the course of a week, Sarah allowed herself to be recruited, vetted, and gradually introduced to the entire enemy network. She provided carefully crafted intelligence that appeared valuable, but was actually designed to expose the agent's methods and priorities. By the end of the exercise, she had identified every member of the network and gathered detailed intelligence about their operations. "Brilliant," commented the exercise director during the debrief. "Instead of trying to catch the fish, you became the bait. You turned your apparent weakness into the perfect operational asset." Sarah's reputation continued to grow throughout Phase 2 training. Instructors began using her approaches as case studies for other candidates. She was invited to guest lecture on adaptive tactics and unconventional operational planning. Military intelligence analysts sought her input on real-world scenarios where traditional approaches had proven ineffective. But perhaps the most significant moment came during a hand-to-hand combat demonstration. The instructors had brought in 4 active-duty commandos from various elite units to provide realistic opposition for the Phase 2 candidates. The commandos were introduced as experienced operators who would test the candidates' combat skills under pressure. The commandos were impressive specimens, tall, muscular, obviously well-trained, and carrying themselves with the confidence of men who had survived numerous real combat situations. They looked at the Phase 2 candidates with barely concealed amusement, clearly expecting to easily dominate the exercise. When Sarah was matched against the first commando, she could hear snickers from some observers. The contrast was stark, a small woman with a visible limp facing off against a Special Forces veteran who outweighed her by 60 pounds and had years of combat experience. The commando, to his credit, treated her with respect rather than condescension. "Ma'am, I'll try not to hurt you too badly," he said with a slight smile. "I appreciate that," Sarah replied calmly. "Please don't take it personally when I have to embarrass you in front of your friends." The comment drew laughs from the spectators, but the commando's expression grew more serious. He could see something in Sarah's eyes that suggested she was not intimidated by his size or reputation. When the exercise began, the commando attempted to use his reach and strength advantages to control the engagement. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been in numerous real fights, but Sarah's response was unlike anything he had encountered before. She flowed around his attacks like liquid, her limp creating movement patterns that his training hadn't prepared him for. Every time he thought he had her positioned for a decisive strike, she would be somewhere else, moving in ways that seemed to defy conventional tactical thinking. Within 90 seconds, the commando was on the ground, effectively neutralized by a series of strikes and throws that had used his own momentum against him. He lay there for a moment, clearly stunned by what had just happened. "How did you do that?" he asked as Sarah helped him to his feet. "Years of practice," she replied simply. The second commando had watched the first engagement carefully and approached his match with Sarah with much more caution. He was a grappling specialist, confident that his ground fighting skills would neutralize her unconventional movement patterns. If he could get her on the ground, his size and strength advantages would become decisive. But Sarah had anticipated this approach. When he attempted to close for a takedown, she used his own momentum to throw him, following him to the ground in a position that immediately gave her control. Her understanding of leverage and pressure points, developed through years of compensating for her physical limitations, allowed her to dominate the larger, stronger opponent through technique rather than brute force. The second commando tapped out within 60 seconds. The third and fourth commandos exchanged nervous glances. This was not going according to their expectations. They decided to approach their matches with maximum aggression, hoping to overwhelm Sarah before she could establish her rhythm and control. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Sarah's entire fighting philosophy was based on using aggression against her opponents. The more forcefully they attacked, the more momentum she had to work with. Both commandos found themselves defeated within moments of engaging her, victims of their own strength and intensity. The demonstration ended with 4 highly trained Special Forces operators sitting on the mat, looking stunned and slightly embarrassed. Sarah stood among them, barely breathing hard, offering to help them to their feet with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the engagement. The room was completely silent for several long seconds. Then, spontaneously, the entire group of observers began to applaud. It started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but quickly built to sustained, enthusiastic applause that lasted for nearly a minute. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the commandos themselves. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, each one approached Sarah individually to shake her hand and express their respect for her abilities. "Ma'am," said the first commando, "I've been in special operations for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. That was genuinely impressive." The second commando was even more direct. "I'm going to recommend to my unit that we bring you in to teach our people some of your techniques. What you're doing could save lives in real operations." News of the demonstration spread quickly through the military's special operations community. Within days, Sarah began receiving informal inquiries from various units about the possibility of providing training or consultation on unconventional combat techniques. More importantly, her performance had definitively silenced any remaining doubts about her capabilities among her peers and instructors. The woman with the limp was no longer an anomaly to be questioned or explained. She was simply recognized as one of the most capable operators in the program. General Walsh summoned Sarah to her office the following week for what she described as a career planning discussion. "Sean," the general began without preamble, "your performance over the past several months has been extraordinary. You've consistently exceeded expectations and demonstrated capabilities that could be genuinely valuable to our most sensitive operations." Sarah waited quietly for the general to continue, sensing that this conversation would be important for her future. "I'm going to be direct with you," General Walsh continued. "We want to fast-track you for assignment to Task Force Omega, our most classified operational unit. The work would be extremely dangerous, highly sensitive, and completely off the books. You would be operating in situations where failure could have national security implications." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Task Force Omega was legendary within military intelligence circles, rumored to handle the operations that were too sensitive or too dangerous for conventional special forces units. "What would be expected of me?" Sarah asked. "Everything," the general replied simply. "Your unique skills and approach to problem-solving could be exactly what we need for certain types of operations. But I need to be clear, this assignment would change your life completely. You would essentially disappear from normal military channels. Your family and friends would be told that you've been transferred to a classified assignment with no further details available." Sarah considered the offer carefully. It represented everything she had worked toward since deciding to pursue military service, but it also meant abandoning any hope of a normal life or career progression. "How much time do I have to decide?" she asked. 72 hours, General Walsh replied. "After that, we'll need to move forward with other candidates." Sarah left the general's office with her head spinning. She had achieved more than she had ever dared to hope when she first enlisted, but now she faced a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of her future. The girl with the limp had proven that she belonged among the military's elite. Now she had to decide just how elite she was willing to become. Sarah's decision to join Task Force Omega came after 71 hours and 58 minutes of agonizing deliberation. She had spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the implications of accepting an assignment that would effectively erase her identity from normal military records and separate her from everyone she had known. In the end, the decision came down to a simple question. Could she live with herself if she turned down the opportunity to serve at the highest levels of national security? The answer was no. General Walsh showed no surprise when Sarah reported her acceptance. "I expected as much," she said simply. "Your psychological profile indicated that you would ultimately choose duty over personal comfort. Report to Building 847 at 0600 tomorrow morning. Bring nothing except the clothes on your back." Building 847 was not on any official base map, located in a section of the installation that required special clearance to access. When Sarah arrived the next morning, she found herself in a sterile, windowless complex that looked more like a high-tech laboratory than a military facility. Her orientation to Task Force Omega was conducted by a man who introduced himself only as Director Martinez. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, and spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to wielding significant power behind the scenes. "Welcome to the most classified unit in the United States military," Martinez began. "Officially, we don't exist. Unofficially, we handle operations that are too sensitive, too dangerous, or too politically complicated for conventional Special Forces units." Sarah was shown to a briefing room where she met the other current members of Task Force Omega. There were only 12 operatives in total, each representing the absolute pinnacle of their respective specialties. She recognized none of them, which was exactly the point. These were individuals who had been selected for their ability to operate completely independently in the most hostile environments imaginable. "Chun," Director Martinez said, "your specialty within the unit will be unconventional operations. Situations where traditional military approaches have failed or are inappropriate. Your unique skill set and adaptive thinking make you ideal for assignments where blending in and thinking outside established protocols are essential." Over the following months, Sarah underwent the most intensive training of her life. Where Phase 2 of the Special Operations Program had been challenging, Task Force Omega training was designed to prepare operatives for scenarios that bordered on the impossible. She learned advanced surveillance techniques that allowed her to gather intelligence in hostile urban environments without detection. She mastered weapons systems that didn't officially exist in any military inventory. She studied psychological manipulation techniques that could break enemy agents without leaving any physical evidence. Most importantly, she learned to operate completely alone for extended periods, making life-or-death decisions without any backup or support from command structures. Task Force Omega operatives were expected to function as completely autonomous units, capable of adapting to any situation using only their training and judgment. Sarah's first real assignment came 6 months after joining the unit. A terrorist organization had taken control of a luxury resort in Eastern Europe, holding over 200 wealthy international guests as hostages. Conventional rescue operations had been deemed impossible due to the political sensitivities involved and the sophisticated security measures the terrorists had implemented. This is exactly the kind of situation where your unique capabilities could make the difference, Director Martinez explained during the mission briefing. "The terrorists are expecting military assault teams. They're not expecting someone who can walk right past their security measures." The operation required Sarah to infiltrate the resort posing as a disabled journalist covering the hostage situation for international media. Her cover story was that she represented a humanitarian organization seeking to negotiate for the release of elderly and disabled hostages. The infiltration phase went exactly as planned. The terrorists saw Sarah's limp and immediately categorized her as a non-threat, allowing her access to areas of the resort that would have been impossible for conventional operatives to reach. She was able to gather detailed intelligence about the facility layout, guard positions, and hostage locations while maintaining perfect cover as a concerned journalist. But the mission took an unexpected turn when Sarah discovered that the terrorist operation was more complex than intelligence reports had indicated. They weren't just holding hostages for ransom. They were using the situation as cover for a larger operation involving the theft of classified information from several government officials who were among the guests. Sarah found herself facing a choice: complete the original mission by calling in the rescue operation, or adapt to the new intelligence and attempt to prevent the information theft as well. The decision had to be made immediately, with no opportunity to consult with her handlers. She chose to adapt. Working alone, Sarah spent the next 18 hours systematically identifying and neutralizing the terrorist network's intelligence operation while maintaining her cover as a harmless journalist. She used her access to the hostages to identify which government officials were being targeted, then implemented countermeasures to protect their sensitive information. The operation culminated in a confrontation that perfectly demonstrated why Sarah had been selected for Task Force Omega. When the terrorists finally realized that their intelligence operation had been compromised, they traced the interference back to the disabled journalist who had seemed so harmless. 4 of their most experienced operatives cornered Sarah in a service corridor of the resort, intending to interrogate and eliminate what they assumed was a low-level intelligence asset. They expected to quickly overpower a disabled woman and extract information about who she was working for. Instead, they encountered something that their training and experience had never prepared them for. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Sarah moved through the 4 operatives like a force of nature, her unconventional movement patterns and precise striking techniques creating chaos in the confined space. The terrorists found themselves unable to predict her movements or coordinate their attacks effectively. One operative would line up what appeared to be a clean shot, only to discover that Sarah's limp had caused her to bob out of his line of fire at exactly the right moment. Another would attempt a grappling move, only to find that her unusual balance and leverage made conventional holds impossible to maintain. By the time the engagement was over, all 4 operatives were unconscious, secured with their own equipment, and stripped of their communications gear. Sarah had sustained only minor injuries and had maintained operational security throughout the confrontation. The rescue operation that followed was flawless. With the intelligence network neutralized and detailed information about guard positions and hostage locations, the international response team was able to liberate all hostages without casualties. The stolen intelligence was recovered, and the terrorist network was completely dismantled. But what made the mission truly remarkable was that most of the hostages never realized that their rescue had been facilitated by the disabled journalist who had interviewed many of them during their captivity. Sarah had completed one of the most complex operations in Task Force Omega history while maintaining perfect cover throughout. The mission report became required reading for intelligence analysts throughout the Western Alliance. Sarah's approach had demonstrated new possibilities for unconventional operations that could be applied to a wide range of scenarios where traditional methods had proven inadequate. Word of her success reached the highest levels of government. She was personally commended by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence, though the commendations would never appear in any official record. More importantly, her success established her reputation within the intelligence community as an operative capable of achieving the impossible. Requests for her services began coming from allied nations and international organizations facing situations where conventional approaches had failed. Over the next 2 years, Sarah participated in operations on 5 continents, each one more complex and dangerous than the last. She prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands. She neutralized espionage networks that threatened national security. She rescued hostages from situations that other elite units had deemed impossible. Through it all, she continued to face the same skepticism and doubt that had followed her throughout her military career. Foreign operatives, criminal organizations, and terrorist groups consistently underestimated her capabilities based on her physical appearance. Their mistakes became her tactical advantages. But perhaps the most significant mission came in her 3rd year with Task Force Omega. Intelligence agencies had identified a rogue military unit that was selling advanced weapons technology to international criminal organizations. The unit was led by a former Special Forces colonel who had recruited a team of elite operatives from various nations. Conventional law enforcement and military responses had failed because the rogue unit had extensive knowledge of standard operational procedures and could anticipate traditional approaches. They had established their base in a remote facility that was effectively impregnable against conventional assault. This group consists of some of the most dangerous individuals on the planet, Director Martinez explained during the mission briefing. Their leader, Colonel Viktor Petrov, is a former Spetsnaz commander with 20 years of combat experience. His team includes operatives from the British SAS, American Delta Force, French Foreign Legion, and Israeli Special Forces. Sarah studied the intelligence files on each member of the rogue unit. They were indeed formidable opponents, highly trained, extensively experienced, and led by a brilliant tactical mind who had successfully evaded capture for over a year. The mission parameters are simple, Martinez continued. Infiltrate the facility, gather evidence of their weapons trafficking operation, and neutralize the unit's capability to continue operations. Rules of engagement are at your discretion, but remember that we need some of them alive for intelligence purposes. The infiltration required Sarah to pose as a potential customer for the rogue unit's services. Her cover identity was as a representative of a fictional terrorist organization seeking to purchase advanced anti-aircraft weapons. The role required her to project an image of dangerous competence while maintaining the physical vulnerability that was essential to her operational approach. The initial contact went smoothly. The rogue unit's screening process was thorough, but Sarah's carefully crafted identity passed their security checks. She was invited to their facility for a demonstration of their available weapons systems, bringing her deep into the heart of their operation. The facility was as impressive as intelligence reports had indicated, a former Soviet military installation that had been extensively modified with state-of-the-art security systems and defensive positions. It would have been impossible to assault directly without massive casualties and collateral damage. But Sarah wasn't planning an assault. She was planning something much more subtle and devastating. Over the course of 3 days, she gathered extensive evidence of the weapons trafficking operation while maintaining her cover as a potential customer. She identified the sources of their stolen weapons, documented their customer base, and mapped their distribution networks. More importantly, she began to understand the psychological dynamics within the rogue unit. Despite their impressive individual credentials, they had developed a dangerous overconfidence in their abilities and a corresponding tendency to underestimate potential threats. Their leader, Colonel Petrov, was particularly susceptible to this weakness. His success in evading capture had convinced him that he was untouchable, and his arrogance had infected the entire team. They saw Sarah's disability and assumed that she represented a low-risk customer who could be easily controlled if problems arose. Sarah encouraged this perception, playing the role of a desperate terrorist representative who needed their weapons but lacked the sophistication to pose any threat to their operation. She allowed them to see her struggle with certain physical tasks, reinforcing their assumption that she was harmless. The deception was so effective that by the 3rd day, the security measures around Sarah had been significantly relaxed. She was allowed to move freely through much of the facility, given access to sensitive areas, and included in discussions about operational security that should have been restricted to trusted personnel. It was during one of these discussions that Sarah learned about a planned weapons delivery that would put advanced surface-to-air missiles in the hands of a terrorist organization planning to attack civilian aircraft. The delivery was scheduled for the following morning, and failure to prevent it would result in hundreds of civilian casualties. Sarah realized that her mission parameters had just changed. She could no longer simply gather evidence and call for backup. She needed to prevent the weapons transfer and neutralize the rogue unit immediately, working alone against some of the most dangerous operatives in the world. The engagement began at dawn, when the weapons delivery was scheduled to commence. Sarah had spent the night positioning herself for maximum tactical advantage, using her detailed knowledge of the facility layout to plan a sequence of actions that would systematically eliminate the rogue unit's capabilities. The first phase involved neutralizing the facility's communications and security systems. While the rogue operatives were focused on preparing for the weapons transfer, Sarah moved through the installation like a ghost, disabling key systems and establishing the conditions for the larger operation. Phase 2 began when the delivery truck arrived at the facility's main gate. As the rogue operatives moved to complete the transaction, Sarah initiated contact with the first target, the unit's communications specialist, a former Delta Force operative named Jackson. The confrontation took place in the facility's communications center, where Jackson was monitoring radio traffic from the delivery operation. He was a large, powerful man with extensive combat experience, and he significantly outweighed Sarah. Under normal circumstances, he would have been a formidable opponent for any operative. But These were not normal circumstances. Sarah approached from Jackson's blind spot, moving with the rolling, uneven gait that her limp produced. The movement was so unlike standard military bearing that Jackson's trained reflexes didn't register it as a threat until it was too late. The engagement was over in seconds. Sarah's specialized combat techniques, honed through years of adapting to her physical limitations, overwhelmed Jackson's conventional training. He found himself unconscious on the floor of the communications center, his equipment secured, and his radio credentials in Sarah's possession. Using Jackson's communications access, Sarah was able to monitor the movements of the other rogue operatives and coordinate her subsequent actions. She could hear Colonel Petrov directing the weapons transfer, completely unaware that his communications security had been compromised. The second engagement involved the unit's explosives expert, a former British SAS operative named Thompson. Sarah encountered him in the facility's armory, where he was preparing additional weapons for the delivery. Thompson was known for his paranoid attention to security and his quick reflexes in dangerous situations. But his paranoia and reflexes were calibrated for conventional threats. When he detected movement in the armory, he turned expecting to see another member of his unit or possibly an intruder who had somehow penetrated their security. Instead, he saw a disabled woman who appeared to be lost and confused. His moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She moved with the same fluid, unpredictable patterns that had characterized all her combat engagements, striking with surgical precision before Thompson could adapt to the reality of what was happening. He joined Jackson in unconsciousness, his explosives expertise removed from the equation. The pattern continued through the facility as Sarah systematically neutralized each member of the rogue unit. Her approach was so unconventional, so unlike anything in their training or experience, that even elite operatives found themselves unable to respond effectively. The final confrontation was with Colonel Petrov himself. Sarah found him in the facility's command center, coordinating the weapons transfer and becoming increasingly concerned about the radio silence from his team members. He was a brilliant tactician and a veteran of numerous combat operations, recognized as one of the most dangerous individuals in the international security community. When Sarah appeared in the command center doorway, limping slightly and appearing somewhat disoriented, Petrov's first instinct was to dismiss her as a non-threat. She looked like a lost customer who had wandered into the wrong area of the facility. "Miss Chun," he said with barely concealed irritation, "you shouldn't be in this area. Please return to the guest quarters and wait for further instructions." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Colonel," Sarah replied calmly. Petrov's expression shifted as he began to realize that something was seriously wrong. His hand moved toward the weapon at his side, but Sarah was already moving, her unusual gait carrying her across the room in a pattern that his extensive combat experience couldn't predict or counter. What followed was the most intense hand-to-hand combat engagement of Sarah's career. Colonel Petrov was everything his reputation suggested: fast, strong, skilled, and utterly ruthless. But he was also operating according to conventional training and tactical thinking that had never encountered anything like Sarah's approach. She flowed around his attacks like liquid, her limp creating movement patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Every time he thought he had her cornered or off balance, she would be somewhere else, striking from an unexpected angle with devastating precision. The engagement lasted nearly 10 minutes, longer than any other combat Sarah had experienced. Petrov was too skilled and too experienced to be quickly overwhelmed, and he adapted rapidly to her unconventional tactics. But adaptation wasn't enough. Sarah's approach was based on principles that couldn't be countered through conventional military training, no matter how extensive. In the end, Colonel Petrov found himself on the floor of his own command center, effectively neutralized by an opponent he had dismissed as harmless. As consciousness faded, his last thought was a wondering recognition of just how completely he had underestimated the woman with the limp. The weapons transfer was prevented, the entire rogue unit was captured, and tons of stolen military equipment were recovered. The operation became a case study in unconventional tactics and demonstrated new possibilities for solo operations against superior forces. But, for Sarah, the mission represented something more significant than tactical success. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with an 8-year-old girl who had been told she would never be athletic, continued through years of skepticism and mockery, and reached its apex in a moment when she stood alone against some of the most dangerous operatives in the world. The girl with the limp had not only proven that she belonged among the world's elite warriors, she had demonstrated that her perceived weakness was actually her greatest strength. In a profession where appearance could be deceiving and assumptions could be fatal, Sarah Chun had transformed her disability into the perfect weapon. As she walked away from the neutralized facility, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced down doubt, overcome physical limitations, and ultimately achieved something that no one, including herself, had thought possible. The mockery had stopped long ago, replaced by recognition and respect from the most elite circles of military and intelligence professionals. But, more importantly, Sarah had discovered something about herself that she could never have imagined as a child struggling with a physical disability. Sometimes the very thing that makes you different, the thing that others see as a weakness, can become the source of your greatest strength. It just takes courage, determination, and the willingness to prove everyone wrong, including yourself. Sarah Chun, the woman they had once mocked for her limp, had become one of the most formidable operatives in the world. And she had done it not despite her disability, but because of it.